good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're very lucky to have you, especially supporting all of the scholarship endeavors during this very, very difficult and challenging time. This is all about community, and I see so much of the community out there. Thank you for showing up. I see you, David, and Suzanne, and Chester, and so many of our friends out there. The Paul Chikahisa Memorial Lecture was established by the generosity of alumnus Francis Chikahisa and family, friends, colleagues, and students of Paul Chikahisa. I'm so pleased to recognize Francis for her dedication to establishing this important lecture and the many friends, colleagues, and students who are here today to celebrate Paul's legacy. This is held every year for and we get a speaker who is a community activist and scholar with an interest in social issues related to Asian Pacific Islanders. No more is there a more pivotal and important time to talk about social justice issues that are happening in our community at a time when the disparities that we see in the community is more vivid than ever. And so I'm so honored and privileged to be here with you tonight and to hear our speaker. And I know that Francis and Paul would be as well to continue this legacy of activism, advocacy, and social work in the API community. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor, for that wonderful introduction. So I will be introducing our speaker tonight. Our speaker is Denny Chen, and he is a senior staff fraternity at Justice and Aging, which is based here in Los Angeles, where he works on issues facing dual eligibles in California and federally. He also has experience working with issues related to non-discrimination in healthcare and civil rights more broadly. Internally, Denny helps coordinate the organization's diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. He's also a member of the California Bar and is a graduate of the University of California Irvine School of Law. He received his BA from the University of Michigan. And Denny also serves on the board of directors for the Legal Aid Association of California and is a member of AARP California Executive Council. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Denny.
Great, well, thank you for that introduction, Daniel, and hello everyone. I wanna first start off by thanking the caucus at the School of Social Work for inviting me to speak tonight. I know it's a bit unusual to be doing this over Zoom, so I ask for your kindness and generosity as I also do this for the first time. It's a tremendous honor. I also want to thank AARP for their generous support of tonight's event, and as a member of the Executive Council here in California, AARP California, have been an avid supporter of AARP's work. Before I start today, I want to recognize the severity of the moment that we're in the current pandemic and the impact that that has on our communities. I don't want to make light of it. I think it's really important to recognize that there is tremendous pain and suffering, whether that's in physical lives lost, in jobs lost, in sort of lifestyle and routines having been tremendously disrupted. But I also want to balance that and say that it is an immense privilege to be able to do my work from home and to even give this lecture remotely. So I want us to take a moment and start by recognizing that first. So the talk tonight that I have envisioned has kind of three main components. And the first component is I want to talk about something that I think is important for everyone, which is sort of my journey through and how I got to what I do today. I think it's important because as someone who, I'll talk more about this in a little bit, but as someone who is a second generation Asian Pacific Islander American myself, you know, I didn't have a lot of role models growing up who looked like me. And so I think it's really important, especially for students who are listening tonight, to be able to talk about how it is that I ended up doing the work I am doing now. And to remind us that there was a life before COVID-19, even if that feels like a long time ago, and that there will be a life after COVID-19. And certainly our lives during are informed by the values that we live today. So the first part will just be me talking about myself. The second part is I want to talk about the work that I do at Justice and Aging on behalf of older adults, and in particular, how that touches and impacts the lives of Asian American and Pacific Islander older adults. And then the last part of what I want to talk about tonight, assuming that you all have not X'd out of the screen, is that advocacy on behalf of older adults is, in my opinion, equity work. And the more that we think about advocacy on behalf of older adults as part and parcel to fighting for a more equitable and just world, the better that world will be for everyone. So I want to leave you with that thought at the very end. So let me transition and talk a little bit about how I got to where I am today. I was born and raised in a small suburban community in Western Michigan, hence why I went to the University of Michigan for undergrad. And as you can imagine, that community did not look a lot like me. In fact, it was a mostly white community, mostly Christian, Protestant community. And the reality was that my family stuck out like a sore thumb. In fact, I could probably count not just the number of AAPI students in the school system or in the school on one hand, but really the number of students of color on one hand. And so you can imagine that I quickly learned from a young age that I was a little bit different from everyone else. And so that racialization started really early, you know, and I remember even sort of casual things like going to the supermarket. And I remember the greeter at the supermarket would greet the family that came before us, before my family got there. And then they would greet the family that came in after us, but somehow missed us in that as we were approaching the supermarket. And I remember, you know, the taunts and the teases that little kids say on the playground when you are the only one who looks different from them. And the reason I bring all of that up as context, it isn't because I think, you know, I want people to feel sympathy for me or I want people to be angry for me, is because I think that's really important context. It's important context because I think it taught me from a young age that not everyone is equal, even if that's what we're learning in school, because everyone's experience is going to be different. And really that's what motivated me, I think, to do everything that I do today. So, you know, my parents are first generation immigrants from Southern China. And so they, you know, have a very typical immigrant story. They came to this country with very little education and very little means, started a family restaurant and ran that restaurant for decades. That restaurant supported multiple families until my parents retired, or my father retired just a couple of years ago and the restaurant shut down. And that all is, you know, the story of the immigrant community is really a story of AAPIs across the country. So, you know, growing up in Michigan, when I looked around and didn't see there were a lot of people like me, but I knew that the community that I grew up in, wasn't just a community of white people. You know, if you drove 20 minutes north, it was a community of predominantly African-American residents. And if you drove just 20 minutes south, it was a community that was really mixed. There were white people, there were Black people, but there was also a significant Vietnamese population. That's where my family would go every weekend to get groceries. And then there were also a lot of migrant farm workers, Latinos, who came up from the South and would live in that community just 20 minutes away. And so I think that's also a microcosm for the country and the fact that we have an extremely segregated country. And so I knew, somehow I knew all of that in high school. I had some awareness of that. And so what I decided to do was, you know, looking around, seeing that there was really a need for racial justice work to happen, I went ahead and organized the first ever conference in my community. That was a racial justice conference for high school students. And we got 11 high schools, not 11 high school students, but 11 high schools. and over 100 students to come. And that was really important to me because I think it showed me that even as a high school student, I could do something. I could do something, I could organize, I could get people involved and start really important conversations that broke down the silos that we lived in these communities every day. From there, as Daniel mentioned, I went to the University of Michigan for my undergraduate degree. And, you know, just like it was really obvious to me growing up that being Asian meant that I was different, it also became, you know, there was no running away from that in college. There was a larger Asian American student community, but the reality of what happened was that in my sophomore year of college, a group of students were urinated on outside of a fraternity house. The students were Asian American. They were told to go back where they came from, and the students involved allegedly poured urine on them from the balcony. So there's no hiding from that. You know, there's no hiding from that, particularly when you know that those actions and those that moment isn't just isolated by itself. It is a moment that exists as part of a larger system, and a system that I think, quite frankly, as Asian American and Pacific Islanders, we know really well growing up, that is a reality that we face. So that led to all sorts of organizing in college. I happened to also be in Michigan at the time, when Ward Connerly was putting an anti-affirmative action initiative on our ballot, and fought strongly against that. Unfortunately, we did not win. And then it was in that sort of hate incident that happened in college when I realized and learned more about someone named Vincent Chin. Never learned about Vincent Chin in high school, certainly didn't learn about him in most of my college classes, with the exception of Asian American Studies. And really the story of Vincent Chin struck me. It struck me because the story of Vincent Chin could have been my story. Quite literally, we share the same last name in Chinese. Our parents are from the same small village in China. And he was also an Asian American, Chinese American man growing up in Michigan. It's just that he happened to come a decade or so before I did. And then was, you know, came up at a time when there was an extreme xenophobia against Asian Americans. And ultimately that led to his unfortunate death. And so it was that story of Vincent and really the story of justice and what justice meant for Vincent, or what injustice meant for Vincent and his family, that motivated me to go to law school. That somehow brought me to Southern California. I am not, as you now know, not a Southern California native. But I remember coming to Southern California and thinking, this is an entirely different world. It's an entirely different world because I had never seen so many Asian American serving institutions. I had never seen, you know, so many small businesses owned and operated by people who looked like me and my family. Even walking around, I went to the University of Irvine Law School, walking around Irvine, which, as all of you know, has a significant AAPI student population. All that was really new to me. And it made me think about, you know, quite honestly, how even growing up as Asian Americans across the country, we have so different experiences. Our experiences are informed by whether growing up we can go to a place like San Gabriel Valley and have access to institutions that, you know, bring and continue to promote our culture and our traditions and our values. And not everyone has that. And some people have that to varying extents. So it made me think that, you know, this was a really interesting place to be, while also at the same time going to law school, which is perhaps not as interesting. And I remember at one moment, you know, I was in the law school lunchroom, the student lunchroom, and the law students were in a very heated conversation about the topic of what to bring for lunch. And one of my law student classmates at the time was talking about how he could not handle, food that smelled weird to him. And he started sort of identifying all these different food groups. And in that moment, I realized that as much as I could see a vibrant community of APIs, whether it's students, whether it's businesses and families and communities, as much as I could see that in a place like Southern California, there were a lot of people who still harbored really problematic and potentially xenophobic things, values. And they were not conscious, right? I'm a very well-intentioned law school classmate. But he remarked about how some foods he quite frankly thought shouldn't be coming into the lunchroom. And so this, of course, spurred a really big, conversation. And it made me think that even in a place as rich as California in terms of its diversity and the number of communities who are present here, the lives that are here, that even those types of what I would call anti-American values are there. And so I graduated from Irvine, and shortly thereafter, I knew throughout the course of my law school career, having been spurred by the murder of Vincent Chin, that I wanted to do something in what we call public interest law, which means that you're fighting for people who don't have a chance to fight for themselves. But I didn't quite know exactly what that would mean, and ended up at my organization now, which is Justice in Aging. And it's a surprise, right? I mean, in what I've told you now in the past 10 minutes or so of my life, I didn't mention older adults at all. And that's because I think, older adults, and this is something that I'll talk about more later, older adults and the way that we think about older adults is really quite unfair. And it's unfair because I think even many of us have internalized ageist beliefs about the importance of older adults in our lives. I don't think anyone would say that they aren't important, but how we think about them in movement building and how we think about them in the work that we do to fight for a better world, older adults often aren't part of that picture. And so it's no surprise to me that didn't really show up in my life until I saw this posting at Justice in Aging for a healthcare attorney and decided to apply. So let me give you a little bit of context for the work that I do every day at Justice in Aging. In case you haven't heard of us, we are a relatively small organization, so I'm not going to be offended that you haven't heard of us. But we are a national legal advocacy organization. Most of our staff is attorneys, or they're communications staff and support staff. So almost all of us are lawyers, and what we do is we use the power of law to fight senior poverty. And we do that with a particular emphasis on several different populations of individuals that have historically been excluded or marginalized based on systems of discrimination and oppression. So we fight specifically on behalf of older women. We fight specifically on behalf of LGBTQ seniors, on behalf of seniors with limited English proficiency, and older adults of color. So you can see very neatly where AAPI seniors might fall into that. We do systemic work, so we do policy advocacy, and we do bring lawsuits, but we don't do it in an individual context. So I would not represent an older adult just by themselves. We would be bringing a large class action lawsuit or some type of aggregate action on behalf of a large group of older adults. And I even remember, quite frankly, when I started at Justice in Aging, I was really surprised why they hired me, because I didn't have any background working with older adults other than having older adults in my life, and I didn't have a healthcare specialty a health law specialty when I went to law school. So quite frankly, I was a little surprised that I got the job. But I do have to say this: I think that our mission to fight senior poverty is more important now than it ever has been. And I know that we said that a couple of years ago when there was a change in administration. And so at some point it's going to get old. But as we sort of think about the implications of COVID-19 and what it means on our systems and what it means for the communities that we serve, I see such a huge opening and such a big opportunity for the work that we do. So I work out of our Los Angeles office. We have 3 offices, LA obviously, where I'm based, Oakland, California, and Washington, DC. So we're a national organization, but we have a pretty heavy California focus, given that 2 out of 3 of our offices are based here in California. And I'm also proud to say that I help coordinate, as Daniel mentioned in the introduction, our internal diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. I say this because I think it's really important to recognize that, there are spaces like the caucus where people have a shared understanding and a shared identity. And then oftentimes in the professional world, those don't match up, right? You can go into the professional world, and if social work is as regressive as the legal profession, you will find that you could easily join an organization where there isn't that shared understanding around identity and culture. And so, for example, when I first joined Justice and Aging, I was at the time the only attorney of color on staff, which to me was, I had to do that sort of mental calculus of, do you take a job where you are going to be the only? And as you now know, I grew up as the only, and have been the only for many, in many contexts of my life. But it is a calculus, because that's an adjustment, and that you might have to explain things like, why you're bringing a certain type of food in, or you might get questions at least about those kinds of things. So I had to do that internal calculus. And I also thought it was interesting, as an organization that claimed to fight senior poverty, that so few of the staff represented the communities on behalf of who we were advocating for. I can proudly say that that's no longer the case. The organization has taken great strides to hire a diverse staff that represents all sorts of communities, particularly from our focus groups, focus populations. But part of that is you have to get people to come in the first place, and then you have to have a culture that keeps people there. And so I help coordinate our internal diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, but in my programmatic role, I do work on healthcare programs and policies, and that primarily focuses on Medicare and Medicaid. I will not attempt to bore you at 6:34 on a Wednesday night with the intricacies of Medicare and Medicaid. There is a lot that is happening, even pre-COVID and during COVID, and I'm sure post-COVID, related to all those things. But what I wanted to do was actually touch on the work that I think is really important for AAPI older adults. We do a lot of language access advocacy in healthcare. You can imagine that when you are an older adult, that healthcare is even more important than when you are healthy and 30, right? That missed doctor's appointment, or not getting a particular service, or not understanding what a service means or has the effect of it on your health, is just even that much more critical. And so we do a lot of language access advocacy in the healthcare context. That is a right that is guaranteed under state and federal law, and we can talk more about that if you have questions about that. But I think it's important to highlight how this uniquely really impacts our community. 60% of Asian American and Pacific Islander older adults who are 65 and older are limited English proficient. And that's higher than any other group of ethnic groups, 60%. And I will note that when you break that down and look at specific sub-communities, the rates are even higher among Southeast Asian communities and communities that have not been in this country as long, is even well above 60. And so as well as I do, that the need for disaggregated data helps break all of that down, because 60 really is just an average, and we know that the average doesn't serve anyone. But it is a really powerful statistic, I think. And even, and of those who are 65 and plus, 35% are linguistically isolated in their families, which means that no one in their family speaks English well or very well. And so you can imagine what that might mean when you are an older adult. For example, you have an older adult who is limited English proficient, and their spouse is also limited English proficient and an older adult. They don't have anyone in that family structure who can help them navigate, as I think many of us did on behalf of our parents and grandparents, the outside systems and help bridge that gap. So 35%, which is a pretty significant percentage, are linguistically isolated. We also do a lot of advocacy at Justice and Aging, in addition to language access and healthcare, on cultural competency in what we call home and community-based services. These are services that help people stay in the community, stay at home, and delay or prevent them from being institutionalized and entering a nursing home. So, this means that when we're talking about, serving AAPI older adults, that the needs aren't just taking every document and making sure that they're translated, which is a really important first step, but that's not where it ends. And it also doesn't end when you make sure the person has an interpreter. That's also where it doesn't end. But it really has to continue. It continues in the provision of services. I think one really good example of this is a personal example of my own grandmother, my paternal grandmother, who shortly before she passed away entered a skilled nursing facility when the care at home just became, it was not feasible to care for her at home anymore. And I remember I was really fortunate to have the opportunity to visit her before she passed away at that nursing facility. And I remember entering the room, and I remember all the steps that my family, who was local in Michigan, because at that time I'd already moved to California, had taken to try and make the nursing home an actual home for her. I remember that, I remember seeing quite vividly salads that were on her table on her bed, and they were untouched. The lettuce was still there, the tomatoes were still there, the dressing was still there. And I remember asking someone at some point, like, what's going on with grandma? Is she not eating? And they said, well, she's not used to eating salad. She's not used to eating raw vegetables. And when they tried to feed it to her, her body couldn't handle it. Her body wasn't used to it. So my local family members were literally bringing in food almost every day that she was used to eating, because the food at the nursing facility was stuff that she wasn't eating, the rest of her life. I remember seeing on the whiteboard, there was a whiteboard, my paternal grandmother, as is my maternal grandmother, doesn't speak a drop of English and couldn't communicate with the nurses there. So my family had written really basic Romanized Chinese onto the whiteboard for the staff at the nursing facility to say to her, as sort of a dictionary or like a translator, a makeshift Google Translate, to be able to try and communicate with her as she's living the last days, months, and weeks of her life. All that story is to say that translation and interpretation is the start, but really ensuring that people have the services when they're at home or in the community or at an institution that recognizes who they are and shows that they are a whole person and doesn't just use some cookie cutter approach, is part of the advocacy work that we do at Justice and Aging. I also want to recognize, because I bet some of you are thinking, how on earth is a lawyer telling me about the role of the work of social work? And it is a really great question. I am not a social worker by training, but I can tell you why I think the role of social work is so important, and particularly in fighting for justice for our community and our community of older adults. In my work every day, we rely, I said before that we don't do direct services, so we don't see individual clients, we do systemic advocacy, and all of that relies on eyes and ears on the ground of people who are skilled, trained advocates, passionate for the communities that they serve. So many of those people are social workers, I kid you not. And so I literally was just got an email 2 hours ago from a social worker up in the Bay Area who I've been emailing back and forth about a Medicaid issue. Our work would not be possible. We would not be able to advocate on behalf of older adults if we didn't know what their issues were, if we didn't know what problems they were seeing with their public benefits and other systems that are designed to support them. And that's why it's so important that skilled social workers who are passionate and reflective of the communities they serve are part of our network and part of, informing the work that we do and the advocacy that we bring. We would not be able to do our work without social workers. And so that's a little bit about me. It's a little bit about the work that we do at Justice and Aging. And I want to leave you with a thought around advocacy for older adults being equity work. And this is something that I had mentioned before. I hope it is controversial enough, or at least intriguing enough to make you think. And if there's one thing that I want you to leave with at the end of this conversation, it is that I really think that I've made the case, or I've tried to at least make the case, that advocacy on behalf of older adults must be part and parcel with equity work. So I start this by saying that every year I go to these recruitment fairs where we are recruiting law students to come work with us for the summer. And I'm sure there are like many other recruitment fairs in other industries where you're sitting at a table and people come and they drop off resumes and you talk to a bunch of people and then you go home and you hope that people apply. I can tell you that when I sit there and I have the sign that says Justice and Aging, I don't have a line of people waiting to talk to me. I am pretty happy if I'm sitting there for half a day and I get 4 or 5 people who are genuinely interested in the work that I do and I think would make good summer interns with us for the summer. And I can look over, and this is no offense to any other cause or any other population, but I look over and I see the line for the children's legal advocacy groups. And they're just, they don't have enough people. They're swamped. There's just a line of people waiting to talk to the poor person. And then I turn to my right and I see, people who do work on behalf of immigrants and immigrant communities. And they also can't get a word in edgewise and they can barely breathe and take a bathroom break because their line is also so long. And I'm sitting there twiddling my thumbs. And the reason I bring that up is because I think that we don't see older adults as a collective group of people that we advocate for. It's not a super sexy cause. It is not something that is prioritized in how we teach about law school, but also how we think about our communities and how our communities are formed more broadly. And I think that that is, number one, inherently ageist. And number two, I think that the schism between what I would call a traditional civil rights movement or traditional equity work and older adults is completely imaginary. It's a self-imposed dichotomy that I think we have the power to change and to disrupt. We all know older adults in our communities. But when we think about racial justice or we think about advocating for equity, are we thinking about our older adults? I don't think we generally do, because I think when we think of older adults in our brain, we often think of older, rich, retired people who live in Florida. And I don't mean that as a joke, or I don't mean it to be sort of funny, but I think that's generally who we have in mind. They're pretty comfortable, physically able, white, English-speaking older adults. That's kind of who comes to mind. And we don't often think about the very own older adults in our communities and the ones that we live with, who we grow up with, and the ones who pass along in our communities rich traditions, cultures, and languages. We don't think about them inherently when we think about older adults. When we think about a place like AARP, when we think about a place like a senior nursing facility, or we think of a senior center, we don't think about those communities as being the same communities that we come from. And that's something that we need to continue to do, that we need to disrupt in some way. because I think that the intersection of age and race shows you that sometimes needs are different. And when we think about racial justice advocacy and impose upon that a layer of advocating for older adults in that advocacy, I think the conclusion oftentimes is that the odds are stacked against you as an older adult, as an AAPI older adult. And let me make that case. I think that the odds are stacked against you because there's so many different things working at that intersection between age and race that make it really hard to come out on top. I think that COVID-19 shows us just how critical that intersection is. So first and foremost, we know that older adults are more susceptible. It is not a coincidence that Governor Newsom, in his initial stay-at-home orders in the Bay Area and their initial shelter-in-place orders, asked that older adults stay at home first, because they knew that generally the older you were, the more likely you were to die from COVID-19. We've seen that as a part of now massive death rates in nursing facilities across the country. And we also see that very own ageism creep into government policies. A number of states have released what are known as crisis care standards. These are documents that tell a healthcare provider how to allocate a ventilator when there's a surge in demand. Who do you give the ventilator to? And in these government policies, whether they're draft form or final form, we often see older adults get the short end of the stick. Some of these policies will explicitly say older adults are given lower priority, or sometimes they'll say in the event of a tie, you can't decide who to give it to, there's a formula, and if the formula it ends up in a tie, then we will give the ventilator to the younger person. That's inherently ageist, it's inherently problematic, and it shows you how deeply entrenched ageism is in the work that we're doing and in the country that we're living in. We've also seen that in this moment, when we all know healthcare is a human right, and that right is even more precious for older adults during COVID-19, we've seen people have lack of access to language access. There are heartbreaking stories out of New York where we know the situation is particularly bad, where limited English proficient patients don't end up getting an interpreter. And they sometimes means that they don't end up getting the care that they need. And I suggest this not as a critique, but as a gap that we need to work hard to fill. There is ongoing data that continues to get reported, but I'll tell you that the data that comes out, and we've seen the headlines about how bad the data is from a perspective for folks of color and communities of color. But the data also really highlights that there needs to be both disaggregated data, we know that as AAPIs, but also intersectional data. At a national level, there is no requirement that the data that is being reported to the CDC by local and state jurisdictions breaks down death by age. And that's inherently problematic because as we think about our response to COVID-19 and what policy solutions we can put in place to better serve our communities, we know that older adults are more susceptible. I was just talking about that. But if we don't have data to support those policies, then we're not going to be able to create solutions that address that intersection.
Denny, about 5 minutes left.
Thank you. So a couple of other thoughts. One other thought is that we've seen during this rise, during the pandemic, a tremendous amount of xenophobia. And I have to acknowledge it, I have to recognize it. And I also have to say that xenophobia is even scarier if you are a limited English proficient older adult. I will sort of end by saying that I think what this means in practice in COVID-19, I want to take my other grandmother as an example. She's still currently alive, she's in her 80s. but she is in good spirits, but has some pre-existing conditions, is limited English proficient, lives in a senior housing facility where there are 2 confirmed cases of COVID-19. And what that's meant for her is that she doesn't leave her apartment. She hasn't left her apartment since probably late February. She no longer has weekly mahjong gatherings with her fellow grandmas. There's no more dim sum across the street at the restaurant that she used to go to every week. And now relatives drop off necessary items at the door because she's even too afraid to let them in. But I say that because I also say that the flip side of my grandma's story is a story of resiliency. You know, she's someone who in her lifetime has survived war. Her own father was murdered in a country during extreme political turmoil. And in my conversations with her during the COVID-19 pandemic, I've been struck at how grateful she is for everything that she still has, her health, her family, her good spirits. And so I think that what COVID-19 allows us is a real opportunity. It takes a bright light and shines it in the cracks in our system. But we should think about those cracks as opportunities for advocacy. They show how fragile life is for people who live the intersection, particularly of race and age, and how the odds are stacked against them. COVID-19 reminds us just how important equity is for older adults of color. So when we fight for policies that improve the rights and lives of people like our grandparents and others who live at that intersection of race and age, we're fighting for a better world for everyone, because policies that meet their needs and account for the intersections of their identities better serve us all. So we should all be thinking about ways to fight for the older adults in our lives as we work to make equity a reality. And with that, I'm going to pause and end and see if there are any questions.
Thank you so much, Denny. So I think we have a couple of questions. Dom and Steve are gonna take turns reading them.
Hello, so we have a question from Erica. If there was part of the federal funding / budget allocated for older adults, how should it be used aside from Social Security?
There is no shortage of ways to use that money. One thing that we've been thinking about is, I was talking earlier about how to make sure that people get the language access that they need. And quite honestly, the system's broken. Obviously money should be going toward Social Security, money should be going toward Medicare and Medicaid, and improving and making more robust those programs. But if we think about a need specifically for our community of older adults, language access is front and center. And the way it works now in practice is that you technically under the law should get an interpreter. It is a step toward meaningful access as required by the law. But oftentimes that doesn't happen. And particularly during a pandemic, that doesn't happen because everyone is stretched so thin. The last thing they're going to do is try and hunt down an interpreter for your 86-year-old grandma. So I think that funding could be used and divided in a way that helps promote access while also relying on, I think, our community strengths. We have a lot of strengths around community organizing, around community building, around community organizations that serve our older adults and know their language needs and know they're extremely culturally competent. So I could imagine, a program that takes federal funds and helps support the language access needs while also keeping those CBOs, which we know are going to hit, a tough time economically, helps them out.
Another question from Erica is, what are actionable steps to advocate for this group as an average American?
That's a really good question. I think one step is to think about the ways in which older adults have impacted your life. And to remember that when you're thinking about, the work, because there's so many different people on the Zoom lecture tonight, so I'm not quite sure where you exactly fit in, but to think about your advocacy work more broadly and think about your role as a social worker more broadly. What are ways to include older adults as part of that? I mean, some of you might be working specifically with older adults in your practice, But my assumption is, and feel free to call me out if I'm wrong here, my assumption is that many of you are not. And oftentimes we don't think about the older adults in our lives as part of a community. And so I think part of it is having a mindset switch and adjustment that takes that community and puts it front and center when we're talking about equity and we're talking about sort of policy solutions that better serve everyone.
Okay, next question from S. Luke. Sure. Do you have any data on age discrimination in the workplace, public and private sectors?
Yeah, age discrimination is a really hot topic. There is or was, depending on what term you're looking at, a critical case before the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, that looked at the question of age discrimination. It is really, really hard to prove age discrimination. So when I talked about, how age discrimination in older adults and the intersection of age and race should really be part of the broader civil rights movement, I'm trying to make that case to you all. It's a hard case to make because the way that the courts treat age discrimination is even a little different than how they would analyze, for example, a race discrimination claim. The standards are different. It is much harder to prove age discrimination. There's in some of the cases, there is what we call a but-for requirement, which means that you have to show that age was the factor, not a factor, but the factor. And we know as our communities have experienced that the way that discrimination and systems of oppression work, it's a lot harder to show but-for causation. It's a lot harder to draw a really clean linear line that sometimes courts are asking for in the age discrimination context. So long story short, I don't have statistics off the top of my head. I can tell you it's a hot button issue. And it's one that is really important because I think the way that we analyze the underlying legal claim informs how we think about it more broadly. And so I would be in favor of seeing something that, aligns race and age more closely and makes it less difficult for victims of age discrimination to be able to take their case to court.
We have a question from Ren. AAPI older adults in the US are living in a healthcare system focused on patient autonomy, whereas they often come from a culture in which multiple generations are involved in their care. As providers, what are some tangible ways we can balance two schools of thought versus cultural competency?
Yeah, one of the buzzwords and thank you, Ren, for your question. One of the buzzwords in the work that we do and the health policy work that we do that I imagine is also true in sort of the healthcare sector more broadly is what we call person-centered care. And to me, that is what this whole conversation, I mean, if you take sort of a 10,000 foot look at what I've talked about today, it would be person-centered care. And so what that means is, we do a lot of work with health plans that try and make sure that, they are doing individualized assessments and are doing care planning and all this and the other thing. And the reality is that is a very Western style way of providing healthcare, the sort of like rights-oriented approach. Making sure that everyone has a care plan, that you have the opportunity for a care plan, and everyone has the right to sign off on a care plan. All of that is a really Western way of approaching, what some of our cultures have approached as, things around lifestyle and eating and sort of, traditional Chinese medicine. It's a completely different approach. So what I would say, in balancing all that is you serve the patient, right? You serve the individual and recognizing that not everyone's going to want to participate on their care team. Not everyone's going to want the opportunity to read, even if it's in language, their care plan. And that's okay, because I think that, what your question sort of assumes is a tension between those two, is impliedly a tension between the sort of autonomy viewpoint and values and, notions that are, I think, less about autonomy in the way that AAPI older adults live and work. And so I think that tension is not necessarily there. It might be there in some instances, but really if autonomy is about letting people have a choice, and it is entirely up to people to decide how they want to get their care, I think that's where those, in my mind, don't come into tension.
Okay, so my question is, how do you deal with microaggressions? Like when you were talking about in law school, when someone was making about comments about food.
So I'll say this, I'm not an expert on how to deal with microaggressions. I think there's a lot of shared wisdom in our community as people experience these things every day. Ultimately, what I think is important is to think hard in that moment about, and particularly in a moment like this, when I think everyone is taxed in ways that are unusual and are extreme, to really think about your own self-care and your own needs. There are moments where, I think we are trained as people who care about social justice to call people out or some people say invite people in. And that is definitely one approach. But there are going to be times when that's just not on the table for the day, right? Whether, and you're going to do something else that promotes your own self-care and wellness. So I think ultimately it's not up for me to be super prescriptive about how to handle a situation like that. I think what's important is that people get the care and the sort of compassion that they need. And so I would say that, don't feel pressure to do what some would call the politically correct thing. But I also think that, on the more extreme side, if people are experiencing hate incidents, bias incidents, things that rise to the level of hate crime, all of that needs to be reported. And for reasons that I think are obvious around data and investigation, if it rises to that level, then please definitely report it. But I think short of that, people shouldn't feel a pressure to handle something a certain way, or that, and also to think about it like, depending on the context, that you have a moment to intervene and sometimes that moment expires and sometimes it doesn't expire, right? Like you can handle it however you want. And I think Ren's question on autonomy and how we sort of give people choice is also something that's worth bringing up here, because I think ultimately what everyone needs in that moment like that, and depending on what the microaggression is and how you're feeling that day, is going to vary. But I would say, ultimately do what is best for you and seek the help that you need and deserve from your community in a time like that.
And this is a question from Eileen. What have been some challenges when advocating for this population? What have been the most rewarding things?
I think some of the challenges, as I was saying before, is how deeply entrenched ageism is. That's true in, the crisis care standards that I was talking about. It's true in even sometimes how older adults think about their own lives. I know personally, I've talked to my grandma before, and she'll say things sometimes about, oh, well, I've already lived 86 years. Not that she wants to die, but that she's, content, and she would prioritize the lives of her grandchildren or children if it came down to it. And that's what matters to her. And she should have every right to feel that way. But I do think that sometimes that's our own society's internalized ageism that's hard to compete with. It's really hard to dig deep and sort of shift how people think about that, because there are a lot of people who would think ultimately that you should preserve not only the number of lives but also the number of life years, and that people should have the sort of full chance to live out their life. So I think that's one big challenge, is how deeply ingrained ageism is in all parts of what we do. and one that COVID-19 has really shined an ugly light on. I think some of the rewards are, you know, we have, every time we sort of fight policies like this, we are pretty shameless, for lack of a better word, about calling something ageist or about saying how it hurts specific communities. California, for the longest time, was not reporting, for example, intersectional data. So they were reporting separately deaths and cases of COVID by race, and then deaths and infections of COVID by age. We got them to cave, and they started reporting intersectional data. So those sort of small wins help fuel me and keep me going. But you know, it has been pretty overwhelming in sort of everything that's going on with COVID-19.
And
Oh,
you want to take it?
okay. A question from Rebecca is, there is a rise in anti-Asian harassment today due to COVID-19. As an attorney, how do you think the API community should appropriately respond? How would you respond?
It's tough. I mean, this is what I was talking about before, right? I went to law school because of Vincent Chen's story. And the unfortunate reality is that decades after his death, years after I've now graduated from law school and have been practicing law, this is a real ongoing problem. A couple of thoughts. My first thought is that it is so important that there is timely and complete investigation of every single incident that happens. Some jurisdictions like New York have even set up hotlines for people to call and report anti-Asian bias and incidents. That's something that should be happening across the country. And if you, as I said before, experience anything like that, it definitely needs to be reported. I think this is also a time for us to show the rest of the world that the model minority myth is in and of itself a myth, and that's all it is. That the feelings around people in our community as being perpetual foreigners continue to this day. And so I would think that, you know, when someone experiences that, fortunately, we have strong, here in California, we have strong laws that help remedy situations like that and bring people to justice. So I think that's part of the movement, right? Is that we can't necessarily prevent something like Vincent Chin from happening again, which is really unfortunate and sad to say, and I'm hoping I'm not ending on that. But what we can prevent, I hope, is the way the system treated Vincent's case, because that, I think, is the key difference. You know, we are now at a time where the diversity of this country, the diversity of this state looks incredibly different. And I think we have some reasons to believe that, at least from sort of a justice model outcome, that even if something as awful like that happened today, and when it does happen, if it does happen, that ultimately the system would treat it differently and treat it better and give people the justice that they deserve. That I think we can change. And I think that part of that is reporting, part of that is, you know, a media strategy. All of these things that I think we've seen in the wake of COVID are there. So that makes me hopeful that the systems would treat it differently now, decades later.
All right, thank you, Denny, and thank you everyone for your questions. Just kind of as we begin to wrap up, I wanted to give you the opportunity, Denny, for any last words that you might have for the audience today.
I want to again say my thank you to the caucus, to AARP. Everyone, please make a donation to the scholarship fund. I think the link was sent out. And I hope one year to make it to the dinner in person when we can all do this again. But thank you so much for having me tonight and allowing me to share a little bit of my story a little bit about the work that we do and why I think a vision for older adults that's grounded in equity is so important in a time like this.
Thank you. And thank you for being here and, sharing your story with us and having, this opportunity to really get to know who you are and the work you do and give us a chance to kind of reflect a little bit on ourselves and, how we do our advocacy. We also want to quickly thank, once again, like Denny said, ARP. They are our sponsor for the lecture tonight. I know Daphne and Scott are here, and thank you so much for your support. And thank you all for attending. We're so happy that everyone could make it as we had rough transitions from our physical dinner to this, and so we really appreciate everyone showing support. And lastly, if you have not already contributed, please do contribute to our scholarship fund. This will help us continue to support API social workers who are dedicated to serving the community. And the caucus is the only student organization who has an endowed scholarship. And so we want to keep continuing our efforts each and every year. With that, thank you for joining us tonight. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we appreciate each and every one of you for being here. So thank you.